I just wanted to sort of make a few audio notes for myself to share. I am uh, heading back to Hot Springs after a little road trip. It's the first time I've kind of been out on the road, like long distance, since I moved down from Philadelphia. And I'm back in Arkansas and up in the northeast corner, yeah, just over the Missouri line, and had a good day today. A drive. I was in Paducah this morning, Paducah, Kentucky, which is the National Quilting Center, and it's a like a UNESCO creative city. And I went to their quilting museum, and there's a whole lot going on. Paducah is on the Ohio River, and I'm right at this sort of very bendy part of the Ohio coming together with the Mississippi, and there's a lot of wide bends and kind of scary bridges to cross over. And yeah, so Paducah has a lot of development along the Ohio waterfront now, including some steamboat docking and a lot of historic downtown buildings. It's so funny because it's sort of like one of those things in life. If you show up at a certain time of day with a certain perspective on certain streets, a place can look a whole like last night when I was driving in off the highway, and it's about 5 or maybe 7 miles off the highway. You have to go a while to get there. It just looked not good and kind of scary and isolated. And then this morning when I got up, it was beautiful and interesting. So I guess, I don't know, there might have been a Seinfeld episode about that or something about a girl who looked one way in certain light and another way in another light. So that's how it was for me with Paducah yesterday. But this morning it was really beautiful and a very nice town if you're ever looking for a stopover as you head south. And yeah, and then on the way down back into Arkansas, I was off the highway and I saw I guess I would say Madrid, but it's Madrid here. And I don't know if people are familiar, but essentially New Madrid was the epicenter of the largest recorded earthquake in North America since European settlement, I guess they would say. And it was 1811 to 1812, and there were like thousands of earthquakes, but maybe five over a couple days that essentially were felt all the way to the East Coast. And I guess the fault line is much deeper than out west. And so they behave differently. I think they said like along the West Coast, the fault lines are maybe 3 miles underground, but here it's 7, and it's on top of the Mississippi River sediment. And so somehow the geology of it makes it travel much further, the waves when they happen. And so, yeah, so they have a nice little museum, and I went over and I saw the Mississippi there, and toured their museum, which they have a great sign that says it's our fault. And yeah, actually that's why, I live the seismic zone for New Madrid is across 5 states, and I actually put the rider for earthquake insurance on my property because I was familiar with what's going on. I guess they're sort of at a countdown for some more major uh, quake happening. I guess generally there are quite a few in a given year, but they're just like 2 or 3 or under 2 or 3 on the Richter scale. But I guess like a 7 or 8 is somehow like hanging out in the background. But it keeps not happening. So anyway, we're paying the insurance in any event. And had a really good tour there. I was trying to, yeah, no, it was a very, very good tour. And a lot of native mounds. The Mississippian mound builders are in this area. I didn't get to go see those today, but I saw quite a few signs for them. And then also noting this town that I'm in tonight, Blytheville. There's one on the outskirts of town, but it's on private property and it's covered in trees, so you wouldn't really know. Although the curator at the New Madrid Museum said, hey, if you see a hill in this area, it's man-made. Now, it's not necessarily made by, original indigenous people to this land, but it doesn't belong here because everything here is really flat. And yeah, someone mentioned that to me, that it's kind of boring driving through this, like the little, I think they call it the boot or whatever of Missouri, and up into Arkansas. And yeah, it's very flat. And I think I saw a sign for something being like the soybean capital of North America or whatever. So wide open but very lush and green, and so anyway, it's been nice to drive along and see that. But I wanted to, this is what I mostly wanted to share. So I wanted to go to Johnny Cash's boyhood home. And it's the guy at the museum told me, it looks like, so you spell the name of the town Dyess. And so I might say Dice or something like that. But he's like, no, it's Dice. And so you have cash and you have dice, and but the museum won't be. I would have missed the museum. I closed at 3, and I didn't get in until later. So I'm going to stay the night here in Blytheville, which is about half an hour north. And I really didn't know much about Blytheville other than it was bigger than Dice and probably would have a Holiday Inn that I could stay at. But when I looked into a little bit more, it turns out that Blytheville had an Air Force base in World War II that was a training base for Mitchell bombers that were used throughout various theaters in World War II. So it was a major Air Force center for training pilots. And then after that, after World War II, it became converted to, they built a special runway, and like very long runway, and evidently the soil here is particularly good, and it was really easy to pull in equipment to build this really long runway because the Mississippi is not far away, so they could just shuttle in the equipment, all of the supplies that they needed to make the runways. And so it was where I guess a lot of the B-52 Stratofortress, I think that's it. Not Stratocaster, Stratofortress bombers were based, or maybe it was they trained people to fly those Stratofortress bombers here. I don't know how many of them were here, but this was a big center in the Cold War for the B-52 Stratofortress bombers that would carry nuclear missiles all over the place. And it's funny because I don't even think I really thought about airplanes. It was, I guess, before the era where we just shoot them out of the ground, and that they might be flying over. And so when I was Googling some stuff online, there was this Facebook post that said, did you know in 1961, there was a B-52 bomber that blew up over some part of North Carolina and dropped 2 hydrogen bombs, but yay, they didn't actually blow up. So, and that was in 1961. So that's kind of crazy, but there we go. That's some history that they don't foreground. But evidently, so this base, it closed down in the 90s, is now going to be reconverted as a national center to the Cold War. And so they're rehabbing the Air Force Base, but I mean, it's sort of like a federally acknowledged center for Cold War studies. And they've got some German guy from University of Maryland coming to run it. And evidently they're going to have the largest section of the Berlin Wall, other than in Berlin, here in Blytheville, Arkansas. And so that's supposed to open in the fall of 2027. But I guess there's a little display that's already open about the history of the air base. And so I'm gonna go see that tomorrow before I head south to see Johnny Cash's family home. So there we go about Blytheville and the Cold War. I do not know if the Pugwash conferences are going to be in this Cold War demo. It seems like they never talk about those, but and those are the meetings, of course, that were happening up in Nova Scotia, sponsored by Rockefeller affiliates, where all the top level scientists and policy people from all over the world, including people who were supposed to be at war with each other, were all meeting and planning things, but they just don't talk about Pugwash. So anyway, so the other thing I wanted to say is that, so DICE is, essentially it was set up as a New Deal program by, when FDR was in office, and I guess he had his closest advisors, and one of those was the Secretary of Agriculture, and his name was Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace grew up the son of an agriculturalist who I think was also served as a Secretary of Agriculture previously under Hoover, but had a bad time and got really stressed out and ultimately died prematurely from it. But he grew up in Ames, Iowa, which is ironically where Neil Stephenson grew up. So, and home of some of that Department of Energy based stuff. So there we go. So, so it turns out Henry Wallace, besides being a farmer and sort of an early pioneer in biotechnology and what would become the Green Revolution in the post-war era, through this sort of chemical-based industrial agriculture, he was also an occult mystic and a collaborator with Nicholas and Helena Roerich, and that's Roerich. And they were Russian mystic theosophists. The husband was a symbolist painter. and they became an advisor to Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, and then through that also to FDR on cultural matters. They were also big advocates for preserving cultural traditions, and were very interested in Central Asia and Shambhala and traveling in Central Asia. And then at one point, Henry Wallace underwrote an expedition to Manchuria that the Roriks undertook on behalf of the United States. And then that sort of blew up, and then people are like, what is going on with that? And so eventually Wallace got frustrated, and he cut off their money, and they were stranded somewhere in Manchuria. But yeah, and if you look it up, a lot of people sort of make it about Henry Wallace being a secret communist or trying to support Russia to overthrow the United States. But I think it was really way more about the mysticism, and what the Roriks were working in seems to be sort of syncretic aspects of all these different esoteric knowledges, like Christian mysticism and Kabbalah and Eastern esotericism and theosophy, and mashing it all together. And what so Wallace undertook this program to assist as a New Deal project farmers who were skilled in farming, but through no fault of their own had lost farms because of the Great Depression or the Dust Bowl or something like that. And they set up colonies. They literally called them colonies. And Dyess was colony number 1. Again, in Dyess, Arkansas, Dyess, and it was a planned community of 500 people, and I think they gave each family 20 to 40 acres, and I think there was some cooperative element. So it feels a bit, it's not like a kibbutz, I think, in terms of really centralized. It was still pretty dispersed residential living, but it was like a cooperative program on the land run through the government as an assistance program. And so it turns out, so this Dyess was a agricultural department New Deal project coordinated through Wallace, who had these mystical connections. And this mystic Rorik was also advising FDR, who was the key instrumental person behind the United Nations. He died before it was fully the ink was, signed, on the bottom line, but he had set up the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. And so, and of course, there's this sort of paradox of the New Deal versus the Rockefellers, but clearly there was this intermixing, and the Rockefellers were really central to the devising of the UN and donating the land. And so, it's kind of funny because, it's not funny, but I keep thinking about all of this stuff with, Gestalt patterns, right? And Findhorn, and talking to the Devas, and for agricultural purposes, and organic, or organic gardening. And then we've got, the RFK Jr. Nicole Shanahan program, where her main thing was soil, working with the soil. And there's a lot of soil in the Mississippi. Let me tell you, there's a lot of soil, a lot of sediment, and a lot of water. And again, powerful watershed, the 4th largest water system in the world, if you count up the Ohio and the Missouri and the Mississippi. And you imagine all the sediment, right? All of the intelligence of the old stones, washing through with this powerful water, sitting on one of these giant fault lines. And the guy said at the museum, at the New Madrid Museum, that essentially this, the reason the Mississippi is sort of there is because of this deep underlying fault that drains stuff to this particular place. So you've got kind of a really powerful thing going on with the farmland here in Arkansas and Missouri and Tennessee. And so anyway, just thinking about how the Findhorn element overlaps with people on land, interested in soil, interested in tokenizing permaculture and food forests, and then this idea of intentional community, intentional planned community that is working on land, and how all of that information processes from the micro to the macro. So, you've got, an environmental element that feels somewhat animistic, right? You've got the soil and the plants, and they're growing in cycles, and you have the people whose focused attention is managing that in a small community, which feels a little bit like J.G. Bennett's, ideas around psychokinetic communities that he was posing, later, in the 50s and 60s. But this idea of intentional community on the land, and what that means in the context of quantum information theory and the observer and co-creative in the universe, and where Joanna Macy, she has this book about mutual co-arising and systems engineering and sort of where that works with Schumacher and Buddhist economics. And so like if the co-arising is in a higher dimensional space, are people working in a intentional way on land, engaging in that higher dimensional information space? So I think it's all very interesting. And yes, that's where Johnny Cash, he wasn't born in Dice. I think they moved there when he was a young boy, but his growing up years were there. And the other aspect, because I as part of this trip, I stopped in Memphis, and thinking of this land base, like a powerful energy of the water, of the seismic activity, of the soil. The sky is really big here because it's open, and the storms, like some of the areas that I drove through had been hit by tornadoes. You could see that they had tornado damage. So there's like a lot of energy in this place. And then thinking about sort of, this heavy history. And I know we're, getting on to this big celebratory, 250 thing, but, and driving through small town America, like it actually is more healing for me to see, like to reconnect with that part of it, because I was really down on that for a long time. And it's better for the pendulum to like swing to a more moderate position on that. But that said, our celebration, I think my sense is that most people sort of are imagining it as, a holiday, good food, family, fireworks, outdoor recreation, that sort of thing, but they're not necessarily foregrounding like the history part. And, what I was saying about Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, saying essentially, like, I didn't know that the Boston Tea Party, like with the Stamp Act, the stamps were there to like keep the colonists from going over the Appalachians, like into Ohio territory. The British had set up pickets to say like, hey, we're trying to make nice with the indigenous people so we can trade like the French, and we've got other empires to make in other parts of the world. So y'all just stay over on your side for now. Like, don't go over there. That's not your stuff. And, and then we've got the founding fathers and Washington and Jefferson, like looking over going, that looks like great stuff, and so there is this irony in people who are like really, really angry about Trump, but this aspect of like the founding fathers were kind of rule-breaking real estate speculators, at the end of the day. So like, what does that say about us? Like, it's actually a consistent cycle in some ways. I'm sure that will drive some people crazy that I just said that, but I mean, there's some truth to that, right? And so it was the money, the Stamp Act was the money to pay for billeting all these soldiers up and down the Appalachians that everybody was protesting, right? But I think we forget that like us winning the Revolutionary War really meant that essentially we were also like overthrowing rights to land of the original people of this whole continent. And so it's just a weird stacking thing. And, I'm here in Arkansas. Part of one of the displays in New Madrid was talking about the Trail of Tears, right? And not just from like the North Carolina mountain, the Cherokee and the Appalachians, but the northern states, like the Ohio and Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin, and they were coming down the Mississippi on boats and then sent over to Oklahoma. And most of them walked through Arkansas, like in different sections, they were walking through the Arkansas River Valley. So not to like put some like rain on your parade for the celebration thing, but I think like history is complicated. It is really complicated. And that said, I really enjoyed meeting, the encounters I've had with people along the way and the trip I've had over the past week. I'm not 100%, but we have to hold both. I think we have to hold both thoughts. And, there are a lot of these indigenous mounds around. So it's cycles of culture. And so, yeah, just thinking about, wow, I'm sure people imagine I'm always weaving together strange things, but I don't make them that way. I just happen to look closely. So you've got, Johnny Cash and, pre-green revolution agriculturalist mystic, and then a Russian symbolist painter advising the New Deal guy who's creating the foundations of the UN that are moving us towards the sustainable development goals, which appear to be second order cybernetics with token engineering and digital governance that are maybe interfacing with higher dimensional mathematical space. Like, that's, I don't know, that's how it seems like to me. Dice and cash. So yeah, so that's what I'm doing tomorrow. Oh, and just to kind of sew it up together, not to be like I told you so, but I really don't watch television anymore. I'm really unplugged from most normal consensus reality news outlets, and so I skipped dinner last night because I was driving, and I really wanted a nice, good breakfast. And so of course you go on Google, where's a good place? And there's like Mel's Diner. If you're ever in Paducah, Kentucky, Mel's Diner is a really awesome place. And so I went got a nice omelet, and it's kind of cool because they had the TV on, but it just had the closed captions. So you didn't have to like listen to the blah, 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 blah. But I happened to look over. I was reading my book on Whitehead symbolism, my little paperback on Whitehead symbolism. I'm drinking my coffee, and I look over and I see Gavin Newsom wants a new social contract. Maybe that wasn't exactly it, but I think it was kind of like a new social contract. And then like before that, it was like the centrist Democrats are really mad at the DSA. and so guys, like, this is what I'm saying, is that we're imagining we're compartmentalizing these stories into like this team versus this team. And somehow Newsom is fighting with Trump over things. But if you kind of step a level up and realize that we're looking at token engineering at a post-nationalist scale within holons of interest groups set up by the attention token economy, and that all of this is going to be impact, maybe could be linked to Whiteheadian ingression of things from higher dimensional field space, this idea that somehow you're going to tax all the billionaires, which I'm not against, that sounds pretty good, but like, where's the money going? Is it going to the government? Well, what's the government going to do with it? Well, Newsom also wants to like sign up for Claude AI for all local governments. And, I've been saying for a while now that like people really should be paying attention to Michael Bloomberg and his work for the last 15 years in data-driven government, because that's going to segue directly into Glenn Weil and Audrey Tang and the digital governance system. And I'm not saying that to be like, we should all be scared of it. What I think is we should sort of try to reimagine a good outcome for that, because I think the good outcome weirdly seems to be connected with like carrying communities and culture on land, working, voluntarily to make the world a better place through, heart-based intention setting. And and maybe that some of that language that needs to happen, because using language and symbols is really complicated. There are often misunderstandings like that lead to complications. So I have a friend who's trying to imagine a structure that's more mathematical, that maybe is a little more finely tuned or has more clarity, which would be a good, cool thing to try to develop. But we're not going to develop that if we're living in all of these other stories that make us think that we're all against one another. So, you can't understand Gavin Newsom if you're not understanding digital governance innovations that are going to fix things, because, all the bad guys are breaking things. And, the digital governance, the digital twinning, cooperative game theory, data-driven government, evidence-based stuff, impact finance. This is all the stuff that's coming out of Silicon Valley. And Newsom, went to Santa Clara University. It's a Jesuit university. They were in on the ground floor with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the Catholic Charities Foundation, the Catholic charities in the Bay Area around impact finance and sort of all these data structures. And the old me could only imagine it in the bad way. And I'm not saying that like I'm all good with that now, but I just want to reimagine a better story. And my better story is that somehow I think maybe a lot of this emerging technology is just a costume for an animist world that we're co-creating with the field, regularly, but we need some props to do it because we wouldn't believe it's possible in the 21st century if we didn't like call it high tech or have some prosthetics that like let us feel more magical. And so we need that, but maybe some of us don't. So anyway, those are my 2 cents. Yeah, definitely check out the Blytheville proposed Cold War Museum and Dice, Arkansas, and the connections between Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, and FDR, and Nicholas and Helena Roerich. And I'm not necessarily saying they're bad guys at all, but it's just this underlying current, right, of like working with mysticism, working with social policy and metrics, because all of the digital governance system is tied to the UN SDGs, which is really the second order cybernetics. But maybe that is a way of evolving networks to a newer, higher level of engaging with information space in more sophisticated ways that are hopefully good. I want to believe in a benevolent underlying structure of the universe and not a dark one. So I'm just going to lean into that until for some reason I can't. So I wish you all well. I'm excited to get back to my little house and my little garden and my tomatoes. And I think I'm getting pretty close to being able to give a tour of the garden soon. So so stay tuned for that. I'll add a few more things because it might not make a lot of sense to most people why I'm mixing up agriculture and cybernetics and like quantum information space. But I do think that there's some aspect of ecological systems, specifically plants and our relationship to plants, that are important, from the element of photosynthesis and processing of light and converting, light from a distance into beingness here in this plane. So I think plants, it seems like many people who are involved in Psi research also have a background in botany and plants. And so I think that's pretty interesting. So agriculture and plants. And I have this is actually part of my weird Dallas map, but I ended up tracking this guy, Ralph Borsodi. And let's see, I guess I can pull it. Okay. So this map is several years old, maybe 3 years old now, or this part of the map, this Dallas map. But somehow I came across Ralph Borsodi, and he was doing a back to the land movement in the 1930s along the Hudson in upstate New York. And the idea was sort of suburban smallholding agriculture. And it was definitely specifically framed as decentralist. And so that really meshes with the whole Web3 tokenomics decentralized governance system. And there was an aspect of morality, and that's going to fit in with what's going to be coming is like a moral economy or a value-based economy. And again, what's old is new, right? We're not that far off of 2030, and that's 100 years from the 1930s when Borsodi was doing his work. And it was underwritten by this guy, Chauncey Stillman, who came from a wealthy banking family. He worked for the CIA, and he was promoting agrarianism and religion. And of course, in the impact finance space, I think there's something about coherence that makes the access to higher level informational spaces clearer and cleaner. And so the idea of having a coherence through faith-based practices, like whatever they are, having a clarity is probably going to be important. If, again, using this particular lens, it's a story that you could tell. So he is particularly embedded, Chauncey Stillman, in the Catholic Church. And again, Gavin Newsom is as well. And then, there's a lot of hand in hand with the Catholic Church and social impact finance in Silicon Valley, as well as Notre Dame and Omidyar and all of that sort of connects in the religion to sort of coherence and well-being. So Chauncey Stillman was from this wealthy New York banking family, Catholic, backing Borsodi and his projects of essentially like small scale, 3 to 5 acres, decentralist living with a libertarian ethos. And he actually I guess he was associated, Borsodi, with, I'm just revisiting some of this, Monsignor Luigi Liguetti. Oh, look, he's from Iowa, and the Vatican UN ambassador for agriculture. So I wonder if he was over there with Henry Wallace. I haven't Googled that yet, but that's an interesting overlap. In the 30s, Wallace would have been in Iowa too. So he would have been the main Iowa agriculture guy. So that's really interesting that we've got the Catholic Church possibly involved in this. So they were initially starting out getting money from this Depression era funding for Liberty homesteads in Dayton, Ohio. And this was during the Depression. Now, this is different than what's happening from what I understand in Dice, because Dice, it was larger plots, like 20 to 40 acres, and you had to be an experienced farmer. And so these things were, I think, more like people who kind of like the, back to the land vibe that we have going now with some folks. What they were trying this out in Dayton, Ohio. And of course, Ohio is Rockefeller land, as well as, I'm trying to remember, National Cash Register is Dayton. There's a lot of stuff in Ohio. And so it was actually connected to these women. Let's see, Elizabeth Nutting was a PhD student at Boston University, and her husband was a high-ranking military official. And this was done under Hoover. So this isn't FDR. This is Hoover's legislation around Reconstruction finance and subsidies for New Deal homesteads. And now that never really worked out. And then eventually they went over to Florida and started this Melbourne Village, which is like in Satellite Beach, Florida, right next to where all the NASA stuff was happening. And they were working on essentially in spiritualized small-scale community doing crafts, like handcrafted things, which is definitely in line with the J.G. Bennett psychokinetic community, sort of the Meadow Creek model, but pre-internet. And one of Borsodi's colleagues in this, and I think she was actually kind of a driving force, her name was Mildred Loomis, and she was promoting a green revolution around Christian patriot homesteading, but all of it, again, decentralized. And I think these are really interesting people to talk about. Like, what is this history? She developed something called a School of Living, and she taught they were working on small scale farming in Suffern, New York. And so it was like New York, and then it was Dayton, Ohio, and then it was Melbourne Village in Florida. And they started a university, which feels a lot like this sort of lifelong learning program. And they brought in various sorts of speakers from the UN, to sort of technocracy, food systems, Georgism, aerospace engineering, a lot of different stuff. Okay, so that's Borsodi and the small-scale decentralized agriculture. Now, he was an author of a book called The New Model of Land Tenure in the United States, and this is in 1972. And it's interesting because I pulled out 3 co-authors on that book besides Borsodi. One of them was Ted Webster, a Quaker Sufi computer programmer interested in market research, Jubilee, a Jubilee Center, I think that's a finance thing, Sacred Dance based in Putney, Vermont. So that's an interesting combination. And then, Eric Hansch, which I think I've seen some of Eric Hansch's books. He spent time in China and was promoting a land trust in Oregon, and then a Shimon Gottschalk, who is a sociology professor at Florida State, who was interested in Zionism and the kibbutz, and he was proposing in 1973 a community-based welfare connected to community banking. So this is essentially where I'm going with Leotaire and the digital community currency and intention and value setting. And in this, they were... Let's see. And part of his research involved a 1922 retirement community in Moose Haven, Florida, where you were paid to be cheerful. So I guess you can have a UBI if you're happy all the time. It's very interesting to think. So where is this new model of land tenure coming from? Well, a lot of this goes back to Henry George, who was actually born in Philadelphia, and I have another map with Henry George. The idea of a spaceship Earth. He was an influence on Kenneth Boulding, who was an early social entrepreneur, and also a Quaker, because the Quakers are into everything, because in my Animus live action roleplay musical, a lot of it goes back to Philly and Quakers. Evidently, Peter Thiel was a promoter of Georgism. And I'm pretty sure Georgism was that you would pay taxes on land, but not buildings. And so it was to try to essentially get people to develop property. And it's interesting because when I went to that 2022 conference on blockchain sponsored by the Mormon Transhumanists in Provo, one of the last talks was from a young guy from Portugal, and he was promoting essentially Harburger Georgism, which was a blending up of this. I'm trying to remember the Harburger stuff. Yeah, here it is. The Sustainable Economic Development for Web3, Bernardo Vicente. I can't remember exactly who Harburger was, but it was combining Harburger and Georgism with Web3 tokenomics. So I'm not just like imagining that this is a thing, like it's a thing in my map. Now, you could say, do all these people know that it all goes together? And I would say no, but it also could be a self-assembling interdimensional gestalt pattern. So just look at it and see what you think. What stories can you tell with this information? Okay, so the other stuff that's kind of interesting about, a lot of this goes to community development and agriculture. So where was this? Okay, so Arthur Morgan, okay, I guess Arthur Morgan isn't specifically connected to Borsodi, but he was, and all of this seems for me to keep going back to flow. He was a dam engineer, DAM. He was working, essentially he was kind of self-taught, I think. He was doing work in Antioch, and then he kind of got bumped up to running sort of Tennessee Valley Authority programs, which was dams plus electricity. And he actually kind of co-founded the Celo Intentional Community in New York, which was this social progressivism. But of course the name Celo, C-E-L-O, is also the same name as Sepp Kamvar's digital community currency. So Arthur Morgan, so he was a president of Antioch College in Ohio. It's interesting because Antioch came out of a 1820s Owenite socialist utopian community run by Robert Owen from Scotland, and it was based on this new Lanark model, which was a company housing, kind of a company town textile mill project. And it is on the same, so Antioch College, Owenites, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, so New Lanark, I think they got it from someone else. It's in Yellow Springs, which is Metro Dayton. And Antioch College is in that Dayton metro area. And in the Owenite community, there's a Minerva Society, which is an early women's group that was operating. That's like in the 1820s. So Morgan was with Antioch in Metro Dayton. He was a dam engineer who jumped over from Ohio over to the Tennessee Valley Authority and was working in powering. So, and of course, electrical power is central to the circular economy and sort of the socio-technical, cyber-physical, cybernetics. Now, he also, let's see, there is, I'm trying to see, the Agraria Center. The Agraria Center for Regenerative Practice, formerly the Community Service Incorporated Small Scale Community Enterprise. And so Morgan came back and started this with his wife, Marjorie Swan. Now, he was also an activist in the civil rights movement. He was white, but he was an activist in that, and he was a collaborator of his was Robert Swan. Robert Swan worked for Arthur Morgan, and Robert Swan is now affiliated with the Schumacher Center, which is where all of the Lindisfarne Association's 1970s fellows talks are housed around sort of sacred geometry and autopoiesis and systems engineering and all sorts of other interesting topics that I would recommend. But Schumacher was about this Buddhist economics and mutual co-arising, which I'm really feeling like this mutual co-arising is a way of, like Wheeler's quantum foam, playful universe, where we're resonating, and then there's a higher dimensional information space that we're resonating with, and it's a conversation back and forth. And then the way to do that at a more complex social level would be that you would do it through an economic system, probably, because that seems to be the coordinating system that we're most familiar with at the moment, anyway. So Robert Swan's wife was Marjorie Schaefer Swan, and she was a Quaker peace activist, anti-nuclear. And again, we're going to go from don't use nuclear to bomb people, use nuclear for all these other things, including radioactive isotopes for maybe enhancing your superpowers. And so Marjorie Schaefer Swan was friends with Coretta Scott King, and who got her undergraduate degree at Antioch. So that's kind of interesting to think about. So they were working on this Congress of Racial Equality in the 40s, connected with Bayard Rustin, connecting sort of Christian pacifists and Quakers. And Robert Swan met, Slater King, who was a real estate civil rights activist in Albany County, Georgia, at Koinonia Farm, which was a farm to conserve soil. Okay, so that's really back to Shanahan. And it was a forerunner of Habitat for Humanity in Americus, Georgia. So, and then there was this other aspect of the civil rights movement that essentially working on community land trusts in the context of civil rights and setting up agricultural cooperatives for families of color, farmers of color, which again, I'm not saying is a bad thing necessarily. You know, it's having access to land was really important in the South. I mean, that's clearly a huge element, but it's now interesting to think about how we relate to land-based cultural traditions, and within the structures that are coming out that are more cybernetic and conversational, like how do we put guardrails on these systems that may be being implemented so that they're not predatory? Because if we're just rolling with what we already have, it seems very likely that it's just going to be more predatory and repeating bad harms that have already been wrought many times over. And so, you know, as I'm sitting here in the Mississippi Delta, you know, and along the Trail of Tears, like I recognize that there are certain communities, especially if trauma makes you more aware possibly of precognitive or sort of hypervigilant information systems, that there are certain groups of people who, because of their epigenetic lineages, are going to have more access, right, to the field. And so how is, if that's done, if I'm correct, if the story that we're telling ends up being a story that is true, that is quite a valuable talent, right? And then how is that, you know, how does that work out so that the people aren't re-traumatized by offering that into the mix? And so I just think it's really important, because I would never have really thought about this idea of like flood control, water control systems, hydroelectric systems, land-based cooperative systems, how it all sort of interfaces with larger systems of social policy that are tied to the Rockefellers and community development, and MIT and digital community currencies. It's just, it feels like there are a lot of moving parts. And yeah, like I would like to look more at like SNCC and the Albany movement and the work on community land trusts. You know, I remember early on being kind of shocked when I found out that Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, that seems to be sort of the, you know, one of the, at the time, 10 years ago, like a leader in all of this stuff. You know, they were getting money for a fab lab from MIT, which felt like, I'm like, like if you look at the history of what MIT was, like, does that feel good? I don't like how, you know, and again, you're just like, well, we need the money. Well, okay, but once you have the money, you also have that energetic influence, whether or not it's spelled out specifically or not. So yeah, and you know, it just, to me, it really feels like it goes tightly with Gavin Newsom's idea of, you know, I'm sure he's setting up Michael Bloomberg's data-driven governance in impact finance, and it's going to meld nonprofits and government and investors. I just don't see how it can't. And yet so many people are stuck in stories that aren't, in my opinion, the current story anymore, that I don't know where it's going. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with in this map is there was a connection between Borsodi was really interested in the India land reform movement, and it was called the Gramdan model, and they would call it communitarianism. And then, like, I know, like, you say that word, and then a whole bunch of people will jump up and go, "See, I told you so." Blah 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 blah. Okay, it's a word. It's I'm not invested in any one model being the thing that's the bad thing. It's just so essentially what they were doing was there was this BHOODAN movement of voluntary land gifts to the poor by the rich. Sound familiar? Like, it's sort of like this giving pledge. And they were going to create these modern utopias. And one of the people that supported that was Chester Bowles, who was in advertising, a diplomat who managed World War II rations, was connected to UNESCO, had the support of the Quakers, and was running around in India with the State Department. And then he was connected to Julius Stolman with the Foundation for Integrated Education, which again is the Theosophy stuff. So in the Gramdan model, you had village-based participatory governance, which is exactly what this Radical Exchange and Glenn Weil and Audrey Tang are doing. So it's not a shocker that Gavin Newsom is saying, or the DSA people are saying, hey, like, now is the time for the pendulum to all swing back, and we're going to address all of these harms. And I'm not saying that it's good to have wealth inequality. It's actually kind of outrageous, but I don't really trust that. Essentially, it's problem, reaction, solution. You create the problem to pull out the solution you already have. And to my sense, the solution is digital governance based on sort of this bacterial biofilm quorum sensing. Like, how do we use the wisdom of the crowd to, engage? And I think the engagement isn't just going to be voting on policies, although it might start to look that way, but it would likely start to become more like prediction markets. And these prediction markets, I am using my imagination and my knowledge and thinking that those prediction markets seem like they could be connected to aggression, especially if you have people who are situated within a coherent value-based story, which is what religion, even if it's ecumenical religion, will do for people. So Vinoba Bhave, a protege of Gandhi, around prayerful agricultural ashrams, and was part of this Bhoodan movement. And in 1956, he visited Mir Alfassa, the mother, who was the French-Algerian sort of occultist yoga teacher and collaborator with Sri Aurobindo, and she was the founder of Auroville, which was endorsed by the UN in 1968, and as a universal town of peace and harmony in Pondicherry, India. And they got that all set up, right? And I think they were soliciting funds from the Ford Foundation in 1969, and the Ford Foundation turned them down, which is interesting. But the model of this town was a galaxy town with a spiral plan with a piece at the center and a green belt. And it was designed by Robert Anger, who is a French architect in the Le Corbusier style of spiritual architecture. So, like, the idea of a machine for living. And so I feel like these Aurovilles are the intentional communities. They're aligned. They are an embodiment of the UN SDGs. And, like, could they be a utopia? Could they be a supercomputer? Could they be a hedge fund investment? I mean, they could be a lot of things. And so I'm just trying to lay out some of these pieces where decentralized agriculture might end up interfacing with the, like, Sepp Kamper, Bernard Lietaer, Galia Benarti, digital community currency tokenomics, and the Michael Zargham's, like, bonding curves. And just to say, are we going to get to a point where we'll know enough to use the tools well? Or will there continue to be, like, really vast information asymmetry gaps? And I don't know. Like I said, I want to lean into the good thing. And I've mapped a lot. Like, if you zoom out on this map, like, there's a lot in here. Like, there's a lot in this particular map. Like, this is just like one small corner, right? There's a lot going on. But I'm still only mapping a tiny bit. Like, these are the things that are of interest to me. How does Georgism interface with kibbutz and civil rights movements and Black agricultural cooperatives and Nicole Shanahan's soil programs and the FDR New Deal and the Wallace mysticism and UN villages in India and communing with higher level intelligences. There are limitless things to think about. So anyway, I hope you found some of that helpful. I'll put a link to the map in there. I would say if you want to get started, like when you open up the link, there'll be a search bar like right about here, and just like type in Borsodi, and it should take you to this part of the map. All right, good night.